Have you ever felt tired? Not physically, not the kind that sleep fixes, not the kind that disappears after a vacation. A different kind of tired. The kind that shows up when everything in your life seems to be working. You have a job, responsibilities, people who love you, goals you're pursuing, things to look forward to on the calendar, and hey, you're rolling. Yet somewhere deep inside, there's a feeling that you can't quite explain. You would if you could. But it's a feeling that something's missing, and it's not on your schedule, but missing from you. And what's strange is most people cannot define exactly what it is. They know they just don't feel like they used to. By the way, if you're new here, I'm Aaron, and I help you change how you see yourself so that you can stop surviving life emotionally and actually start living it. So if that sounds good to you, hit that subscribe button. I'm glad you're here. Have you ever been there when you're feeling different than you used to? Less excited, less curious, less hopeful, less alive? And because life still feels functional, we assume that this is normal. After all, this is adulthood. This is what life is like. You grow up, you take on responsibilities, you pay your bills, you handle problems, and you manage obligations. This is the life of an adult. But eventually life becomes more about maintenance than it does momentum. At least that's what we've been told. But I want you to consider something. What if the most dangerous place you can end up in life isn't failure? What if it's functionality? Because when you're failing, you know something needs to change. When your life is falling apart, it's obvious. The pain gets your attention. The struggle demands action from you. But when you're functioning, it's different. In fact, you can spend years functioning, years convincing yourself that you're okay because nothing's broken on the outside. Years going to work, coming home, handling responsibilities, paying bills. Years hitting repeat, day after day, week after week, year after year. And eventually something starts to happen. You stop building your life and you start maintaining it. Now, maintenance isn't bad. In fact, there are seasons in our lives when maintenance is completely necessary. Whenever you're healing, you're recovering, you're rebuilding, maintenance is necessary. We've all had those seasons. I've had those seasons. In fact, maybe you're in one right now, and that's why you clicked on this video. And if that's you, then I want to tell you, maintenance was never supposed to be your identity. It was never supposed to become your destination. And there's a huge difference between maintaining a life and living a life. Maintaining is about preservation, while living is about expansion. Maintaining protects what exists, while living is about becoming something more. Maintaining asks, how do I avoid losing? Living asks, who am I becoming? And if we're honest, many people haven't asked themselves that question in a long time. Who am I becoming? Not who am I earning, who am I accomplishing, who am I managing or surviving? Who am I becoming? And the truth is, life has a way of distracting us from that question. Not all at once, is normally gradually. A disappointment here, a setback there, a failed relationship sprinkled in here, a dream that seemed like it's not working sprinkled in there, a business that struggled, a betrayal that you didn't see coming, a season where you gave everything you had and still came up short. And each experience leaves a mark. Not externally, but internally. And little by little, you begin adjusting. Let's just lower the expectation a little bit. Let's just play it a little safer. Let's take fewer risks. Let's protect ourselves so that we're good. And eventually you stop producing possibility, not because you consciously decided to, but because survival became more important. At first, it's temporary. You tell yourself, I'm just trying to get through this season. But then the season lasts longer than expected. Months become years, years become habits, habits become identities. Before you know it, you're no longer asking, hey, what do I want from life? And you're asking, how do I make it through today? And we ask this question not because we're incapable, but because often survival demands our attention. When you're drowning, you're not thinking about purpose. You're thinking about air. When you're fighting to stay afloat, you're not thinking about possibility. You're thinking about survival. And that's exactly what makes survival mode so deceptive. It feels necessary, practical, and responsible. But if you stay long enough, something begins to disappear. Your connection to who you're capable of becoming. That's the real tragedy. Not that people struggle, everybody struggles. Not that people go through difficult seasons, everybody goes through difficult seasons. The tragedy is when the season of survival becomes an identity of survival. The tragedy is when a temporary response becomes a permanent way of living. Because once that happens, you don't just lose momentum. You lose vision, you lose possibility. You lose touch with the person that you believed that you could become. And the scary part is most people don't even realize it happening because survival mode rarely feels dramatic. It actually feels normal. Until one day you wake up and realize that you've actually just been managing a life instead of creating. And that's when the question becomes unavoidable. What if survival mode isn't stealing your happiness? What if it steals something far more valuable? Your identity. Let me introduce you to Joseph. Not because Joseph is unusual, but Joseph is everywhere. If you have met Joseph in his early 20s, you would have noticed something. Joe had dreams, not vague wishes, not fantasies, dreams, places he wanted to go, things he wanted to build, a life that he wanted to create. Joe talked about possibilities the way people talk about plans. There was a fire in him, a belief that life could be more, a belief that he was capable of more. And maybe you remember a season when you felt that way too, before life became so serious, before every decision carried so much weight, before every mistake felt expensive, and before every responsibility demanded a piece of your attention. Joseph wasn't naive. He understood that life would be difficult. He knew there would be obstacles, but he also believed that obstacles were just a part of his journey and not the destination. He believed he was becoming something. And then life happened. It wasn't all at once, and that's important because survival mode rarely arrives through one catastrophic moment. It usually arrives through 1,000 ordinary ones. Joe got his first full-time job, and then bills hit. Responsibilities, obligations, expectations. And on top of all of that, began setbacks that he never really saw come. A promotion he didn't get, a relationship that ended, a business that failed, a season where he worked harder than ever but still felt stuck. I feel you, Joe. It was nothing dramatic and it was nothing that would make the evening news. It was just life. The kind of life that most people experience. And at first he handled it well, and that's what makes it so dangerous. Because survival mode doesn't begin when you fall apart. It often begins when you're doing your best to hold everything together. So Joe adjusted, just like many do. He became more practical, more responsible, and more realistic. At least that's what he called it. And to be fair to Joe, some of these adjustments were necessary. Life requires maturity, responsibility, and sacrifice. But something else was happening underneath the surface. Something Joseph couldn't see. Every disappointment was teaching him a lesson. Not necessarily a lesson that life intended, but a lesson that he interpreted. The promotion he didn't get taught him to expect less. The dream that didn't work taught him to play safer. The rejection in the relationship taught him to quit putting himself out there. The heartbreak taught him to guard his heart. The failure taught him to lower the size of the vision. Again and again, experience became interpretation. Experience became interpretation. Interpretation became belief. Belief became identity. And that's how survival mode begins stealing a person's future. Not by taking away their dreams. It can't take away your dream. But it can convince you to stop believing in it. And that's the part that we don't really talk about. Many don't lose their dreams, they just slowly disconnect from them. At first, the dream gets postponed. Then it gets delayed, and then it gets explained away. And eventually, we become so busy managing reality that we stop creating possibility. That's what happened to our guy Joe. Years passed, and he became successful by many standards. He was responsible, reliable, dependable. He was productive, and If you were to look at his life from the outside, you would say, oh, that's Joe. Everything's fine. But internally, something had changed. The fire was gone. The curiosity was gone. The excitement was gone. The sense of possibility was gone. And he wasn't building life anymore. He was maintaining one. But he didn't realize it because remember, survival mode doesn't announce itself. It whispers. It says things like, just get through the month. Just make it through this year. Next year will be better. Now isn't the right time, Joe. Maybe later. You've got to be realistic. This year's been tough. Don't get your hopes up. And the whispers sound reasonable, and that's what makes them dangerous. Because eventually they stop sounding like fear. They start sounding like wisdom. Joe wasn't consciously abandoning his future. He thought he was being responsible, being a grown-up, and being practical. But practicality had quietly turned into limitation. And limitation had quietly turned into an identity. He stopped seeing himself as someone who creates and started seeing himself as someone who manages. Somehow I Manage. Great book by Michael Scott. You should check it out. He stopped seeing himself as someone who pursues and started seeing himself as someone who protects. And instead of asking, what am I capable of becoming? He started asking, how do I avoid losing what I already have? That's survival mode. And if we're honest, that's where many of you watching are currently living. And it's not because you're weak. You're not weak. It's not because you failed. It's not because you're lazy. Lazy people don't watch content like this. But because somewhere along the way, you stopped pursuing possibility and started protecting yourself from disappointment. And here's the real tragedy. The greatest danger of survival mode isn't that it drains your energy. The greatest danger is that it slowly changes your identity. It teaches you how to see yourself differently. Smaller, safer, more limited, more cautious, until one day we don't even recognize the person that we have become. And that's where Joe found himself. One Tuesday morning, Joe was driving in traffic through a life that he had spent years building for himself. And while he was driving, he was suddenly confronted with a question that he couldn't escape. It was a question that was so simple and yet so unsettling. He turned down the music and asked himself, if I'm honest, am I actually living? Or have I just become really good at surviving? That question stayed with Joe, not just for a day, not just for a week, for months. It was one of those questions that didn't easily leave. You know the ones that tend to follow you. They quietly sit in the background of our lives, waiting on us. It was sitting there waiting on Joe every morning when he drove to work, every evening when he drove back home. It was waiting every time he looked at his calendar and every time he marked something off of his to-do list. Am I living, or have I just become really good at surviving? What makes questions like that so uncomfortable is the simple fact that we cannot quickly and easily answer it. Because from the outside, his life looked fine. Nothing was obviously broken. Nothing was falling apart. There's no fire here. And that's the problem. If someone were to ask him how things were going, he would say, good. And he would have believed it, at least partially. And that's what makes survival mode so deceptive. Many think the greatest danger in their life is failure. I don't. In fact, I think one of the greatest dangers in our life is achievement without alignment, movement without direction. Because when you're failing, the pain forces you to pay attention. But when you're achieving in the wrong direction, you can drift for years. Imagine boarding a plane from Atlanta to Los Angeles. The pilot is only a few degrees off. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious. He's just a few degrees off. But if he stays on that path long enough, he's going to end up in an entirely different place than he had originally intended. That's how survival mode works. It rarely destroys your future overnight. Takes you off a few degrees. Just shift 1 degree of compromise. Let's just shift a little to the left, a little degree of an excuse. Let's just go off another degree, a postponed dream. We're not that far off. Let's just shift a degree and abandon one possibility at a time. And like the pilot, one day you wake up and realize you've traveled miles away from the person that you were supposed to become. And that's where Joe began seeing something that he had never really seen before. The real cost of survival mode wasn't exhaustion, it wasn't stress or burnout. Those were just symptoms, but the real cost of survival mode was identity, because survival mode had quietly changed the way that he saw himself. See, years earlier, he saw himself as someone who creates. Years earlier, he saw himself as someone who pursues possibility. Now he sees himself as someone who manages problems. Years earlier, he saw himself as someone becoming. Now he saw himself as someone maintaining. And that realization hit hard because identity is never neutral. The way you see yourself shapes the way you live. And that's why I feel that calling to help people change the way they see themselves. Because if you see yourself as a creator, what you gonna do? If you see yourself as a leader, what you gonna do? If you see yourself as someone capable of growth, well, guess what, baby? You'll pursue growth. But if you see yourself as someone whose primary job is survival, survival then becomes your ceiling. And that's what had happened, not just to Joe, but that's what's happening to millions of people right now. Somewhere along the way, they stopped seeing life as an opportunity to become and started seeing it as something to endure. Man, just get through the week, you tell yourself. Just get through the month. Just get through this year. Just get through this season. But eventually, our guy Joe realized something. When your life becomes about getting through, it no longer becomes about moving toward. I'ma stay there because I feel that. There's a huge difference between the two things. One person is trying to survive the week, another is building a future. One person is avoiding pain, another is pursuing purpose. One person is reacting to life and the other is creating it. And the gap between those two lives, it becomes enormous over time. Because every day you spend merely surviving, you reinforce a particular story. The story that says life happens to me. The story that says you're controlled by circumstances. The story that says it's your role in life to endure, to protect, to make it through. But that's not the story that you were created to live. You weren't created to merely survive. You weren't created to merely endure. You weren't created to maintain. You were created to grow, to expand, to contribute, to leave your mark on the world and to become. And when that process stops, something inside of us knows. That's the feeling that most people carry, but they struggle to explain. The restlessness, the emptiness, the sense that something is missing. And it's not always because your life is bad. Sometimes it's simply because your growth has stalled. Think about a plant for a moment. A plant was designed to grow, to stretch, to reach and expand. In fact, if it stops growing, something is wrong. Not because growth is optional, but because growth is its nature. And the same is true for us. Growth isn't a luxury, it's part of who we are. Which means one of the fastest ways to feel disconnected from who you are is to stop becoming, to stop stretching, to stop pursuing and growing. But that's exactly what survival mode convinces us to do. Not because it hates you, but because it's trying to protect you. And that's where the story takes an important turn. Joseph begins to realize something surprising. Survival mode wasn't the villain. In fact, there was a time when it actually helped him. There was a time when surviving was exactly what he needed to do. And the problem wasn't that he entered survival mode. The problem was that he never left. And I think that's true for a lot of you. Because what begins as protection can quietly become a prison. And until you understand why you stayed there, you'll never understand how to leave. That's when Joseph began asking a different question. What happened to me? And that question changed everything. For a long time, Joseph thought something was wrong with him. And maybe you felt that way too. You look at your life and wonder, why don't I feel excited anymore? Why do I keep playing small? Why do I keep putting off things that matter most? Why do I feel stuck? Why do I feel disconnected from me? And if you're not careful, you'll start creating explanations. Start thinking maybe you're lazy, maybe you lost your drive, maybe you're just getting older, and that's what happens when you reach 50 and 60 and 70. Maybe this is all life is. Maybe this is just who I am. But Joseph's question began leading him somewhere unexpected, because the more honest he became, the more he began to realize something. Survival mode wasn't the problem. Survival mode had once been the solution. And that's the distinction many never make, because we tend to judge ourselves for our adaptations that once protected us. Think about it. If you've ever gone through a heartbreak, there was probably a season where you thought guarding your heart was super necessary. If you've ever experienced a failure, there's probably a season where you thought playing it safe is wise. If you've ever been betrayed, there was probably a season where you thought trusting these knuckleheads is dangerous. And if you've ever lost something important, there was probably a season where lowering your expectation felt like self-preservation. And in those moments, survival mode served its purpose. It helped you make it through. It helped you endure. It helps you keep moving when life feels heavy. And ain't no shame in that. I'm sorry. There isn't any shame in that. Every person watching this has gone through a season where survival was necessary. Seasons where getting through the day was an accomplishment. Come on, y'all. Let's be real about it. Some seasons, the goal wasn't about growth. The goal was to simply keep going. And sometimes that's enough. Sometimes survival is wisdom. Sometimes survival is courage. Sometimes survival is exactly what the moment requires. But here's where things get complicated. The very strategies that protect you in one season can limit you in the next. The armor that saved you during battle can become a prison once the war is over. Take this stuff off. And most people never notice when the war is over. They never start to feel that shift in life because survival habits don't announce their expiration date. They just quietly stay. The walls stay. The fears stay. The limitations stay. The cautious version of you stays long after the danger has passed. Joseph began seeing this everywhere. The dream he stopped pursuing, the conversation he avoided, the risk he refused to take, and the opportunities he ignored. None of them were happening because he lacked potential. They were happening because an old version of him was trying to stay safe. And that's when he realized something powerful. Most people aren't stuck because they're incapable. They're stuck because they're operating from an outdated identity. An identity that was created in a season that no longer exists. Think about how many people are still living according to stories that were written years ago. Someone embarrassed them in front of a classroom, and now they believe that they aren't confident. They failed in business once, and now they believe they're not entrepreneurial. A relationship ended badly, and now they believe that they can't trust. They took a risk, and they got hurt, and now they believe that it's safer not to try. Do you see what's happening? A moment became a meaning. A season became a story became an identity, and an identity becomes a life. Joseph realized he wasn't living according to who he was. He was living according to what had happened. And that's a huge difference. Because what happened to you is not who you are. What happened to you may have shaped you, but it doesn't have to define you. What happened to you may explain some things, but it doesn't have to determine everything. And that's where the breakthrough started. Not when Joe changed his circumstances, but when he changed his understanding. Because for the first time, he started asking, what part of me is still trying to survive a season that is already over? That's a powerful question, y'all. Because many are fighting battles that ended years ago, still protecting themselves from rejection, protecting themselves from failure, protecting themselves from disappointment, protecting themselves from in the pain, and in the process, they're also protecting themselves from growth. In the process, they're Also protecting themselves from an opportunity, from purpose, from becoming. They're protecting themselves from the very things that they want the most. It's like keeping a life jacket on after you've already reached the shore. We in the parking lot. What you still got that on for? At one point, what once saved you can slow you down. And that's what Joe began realizing. The life he wanted wasn't on the other side of more effort. It was on the other side of a new identity. The version of him that knew how to survive had done its job. Congratulations. You are relieved of your duties. Now it's time for a different version to emerge. The version that knows how to live, the version that knows how to pursue, the version that encourages you to grow again. But before that could happen, Joe had to ask one final question. What does living actually look like? And if you've spent years surviving like our guy Joe, you're going to have the same question. It's very easy to forget what living looks like. And that's where many get stuck. They know they don't want to stay where they are, but they don't necessarily know where they're supposed to go. And until you can see it, it's a difficult move toward it. That's why the next realization changed everything. Joe stopped asking, how do I survive life? And started asking, what does it look like to actually live it? For a long time, Joe thought living life meant having more. More money, more freedom, more success, more time. And to be fair, that's what most of us are taught. We're taught that living exists somewhere in the future, somewhere beyond the next milestone, the next promotion, accomplishment, or chapter. We tell ourselves, when things settle down, I'll live. When the business grows, then I'll live. When the kids get older, I'll live. When I finally have enough money, I'll live. When life becomes easier, say it with me, I'll live. But the problem is the future keeps moving, and so does the version of life that we are waiting to start. Have you ever noticed that? How the finish line always seems to relocate? You reached one destination and immediately created another. You accomplished one goal and instantly replaced it with a different one. You solved one problem and then you discover there's 3 more. And before you know it, years have passed. Not because you were lazy, not because you lacked ambition, but because you've been postponing your life. Joe realized that's exactly what he had been doing. He wasn't waiting for better circumstances. He was waiting for a feeling that never arrived. He was looking for the feeling that he finally made it. He was finally enough. He finally could relax. He could finally become himself. But that's not how life works. Because living isn't something that begins when circumstances are perfect. Living begins when growth becomes more important than comfort. I think I'll say that again. Living begins when growth becomes more important than comfort. That's the dividing line. Not between successful and unsuccessful people. Not between the rich and the poor. That's P-O apostrophe. Between people who are alive and people who are merely existing. Because while survival mode is primarily focused on protection, living is focused on expansion. Come on, expanders. Survival mode asks, how long do I hold on to what I have? And living asks, who am I becoming? Survival mode asks, how do I make it through? Living asks, what am I being called toward? Those are 2 completely different ways of moving throughout the world. One is driven by fear and the other is driven by purpose. One is trying not to lose and the other is determined to grow. And growth gives meaning to struggle. And that's what Joseph started discovering. Nothing around him changed overnight. He still had responsibilities. He still had bills. But he stopped asking, how do I get through this? And started asking, what is this season trying to develop in me? And that question changed his perspective because suddenly life wasn't happening to him. Life was growing him. And eventually he stopped measuring life by achievements, started measuring it by becoming. It's a completely different scoreboard. The discipline you build, the courage you gain, the wisdom you develop, those things become part of you. And that's when Joseph realized something profound. The greatest tragedy isn't failing to achieve your dreams. The greatest tragedy is achieving your dreams while losing who you are in the process. Because what good is success if you become someone you don't recognize? I can hear the verse, what good is it for a man to gain the whole world and lose his soul? What good is it to reach your destination and abandon yourself along the journey? Life requires alignment. Alignment between who you are and who you're becoming. And when alignment exists, something remarkable happens. You stop feeling like life is something you're enduring, and you start feeling like life is something you're creating. And eventually, every single person reaches a moment where they have to choose. Not between success or failure, not between easy or difficult, but between survival and becoming. And that decision will shape the rest of their life. Years later, Joseph would look back on that season and realize something. There wasn't a single moment when his life changed. Wasn't a dramatic breakthrough. There was no lightning bolt from heaven. Why they got God always sending lightning bolts, by the way? But there was no perfect opportunity for Joseph arriving at the exact right time. Instead, there was a decision that nobody else could see. A decision that happened long before his circumstance changed. He decided he was done treating survival as an identity. And that decision changed everything. Not immediately, and that's important, because we've been conditioned to believe that transformation will happen all at once. Suddenly, everything is different. But real transformation looks like choosing growth when comfort feels easier. It looks like taking a step when you can't see the whole path. It looks like keeping a promise to yourself. It looks like believing again and dreaming again. And that's exactly what Joseph did. And if you're in a spot like our guy Joe was, then I want to let you know this. The goal is to stop letting fear decide who you become. It's time to stop allowing fear to make your decisions. Disappointment, past experiences, old stories. Because every time you do, those things pull you farther away from yourself. Not the self that you are, but the self that you're becoming. And that's why this conversation matters so much. Because this isn't really a video about survival. It's a video about identity. It's a video about remembering who you are. It's a video about reconnecting with possibility. And ultimately, it's a video about returning to the person that you were capable of becoming. You were made for expansion, for growth, for contribution. And that's why restlessness won't leave you in this season. That's why something inside you keeps whispering that there's more, it's because there is. And maybe for you, this isn't about information. Maybe this video is about recognition. Maybe you've been feeling for a long time that something is off here. Maybe you've been calling it stress and burnout and exhaustion. And if that's you, I want you to know that I've been there. But what if the tension that you're feeling is the difference between who you've become and who you're capable of becoming? What if the discomfort you're feeling isn't evidence that something's wrong? What if it's evidence that something inside of you is trying to wake up? Maybe it's time to turn the page. Maybe it's time to stop asking, how do I survive? And to start asking, who am I becoming? So before we finish, I'm going to leave you with this thought. One day you will meet the person you could have become. Not literally, but through reflection, through memory, through hindsight, through your inner voice and the spirit within. You'll see the gap between the person you became and the person you were capable of becoming. And the question that I want to ask you is, will that person feel familiar? Or will they feel like a stranger? Will they feel like the life you pursued, or will it feel like the life you postponed? Every day you choose growth, you move closer to them. And every day you choose fear, you move farther away. The good news is the decision is still yours. You don't need a new year. You don't need perfect conditions. You don't need permission, certainty. You need to make a decision. The decision to stop treating survival as your destination, and the decision to start becoming again. Always remember that growth is a journey. It's not a destination. I'm in it with you. And I'll see you